Your inability to cook is very inconvenient, he added, and then he had the nerve to ask me to leave. I couldn't believe it. He came up to me with a smile as if he'd accomplished something significant. It was so outrageous that I was speechless for a moment, but quickly coming to my senses, I replied, I would never let my parents live in our house, but you decided to put your relatives in it without my permission. My voice shook with anger as I added, and you want to evict me, the rightful owner. Luke's overbearing personality had annoyed me for a long time, but now it was making me nauseous. I couldn't continue this way with him. His entitled attitude and the way he behaved as if he owned the house, despite not contributing financially, had worn me down. I am Addison, a woman in my 40s, and I work hard to support our family. Luke, my husband, stays home all the time to do household chores. Although I appreciate his contribution, his bossy nature has become unbearable. His demands, such as asking me to bring ice cream late at night, started to get on my nerves. When I refused, he would threaten me, reminding me of his imagined authority as a husband. This would make me boil with indignation. His constant need to assert his dominance and demand respect solely based on his gender infuriated me. Enduring his behavior, in addition to my demanding job, was simply unbearable. I'm really tired, I finally told him, my voice barely a whisper. I've reached my breaking point and can't continue living like this, I added, and decided to retreat to my room for some rest, seeking solace from the mounting tension with Luke. However, he wasn't pleased with my attitude and confronted me, demanding an explanation for my behavior towards him. Why are you acting like this, Addison? You can't just walk away, he said, his anger palpable as he asserted his authority over me. Feeling utterly drained, I mustered a forced smile and apologized, hoping he would understand my exhaustion. I'm just so tired, Luke. Please try to understand, I pleaded. Luke's disappointment in me was only growing, and I didn't have the energy to argue. I apologized once more and withdrew to my room, my spirit crushed by his overbearing behavior. Day by day, I endured Luke's tyranny, worn down by his constant demands. Then my breaking point came when I felt really bad. I had a stress-induced fever, unable to move, and had to take a day off work. Lying in bed, too weak to care for myself, I told Luke about my condition. He brushed me off, accusing me of making excuses and refusing to help me. You're just being dramatic, Addison. You can still get up and do your chores, he said, his words cutting deep. Alone in my room, feverish and weak, I endured a night of unbearable pain. In my delirium, I wished for an end to my suffering. I longed for a simple gesture of care from Luke, a cold compress, or even just a comforting word. But my desires remained unmet, leaving me drowning in a sea of loneliness and self-doubt. Questions plagued my mind. Why am I the only one subjected to this torment? What have I done to deserve such treatment? The agony of my situation, coupled with Luke's callousness, weighed heavily on my soul, pushing me to the brink of despair. I couldn't help but wonder why things couldn't just work out with Luke. The pain from my ongoing ordeal brought me to tears, and when my fever finally subsided after 3 days of rest, I had to return to work. My colleagues and bosses showed genuine concern, asking if I was truly all right. Are you okay, Addison? You look exhausted, one of my colleagues said, their kindness contrasting sharply with Luke's attitude. Their compassion moved me to tears. I felt I was reaching my emotional breaking point. A voice inside me screamed that I couldn't endure Luke any longer. I knew deep down that you can't put that much pressure on yourself, that someday I would reach my limit. Yet, in my overwhelmed state, I couldn't gather the strength to confront the situation or contemplate preparing for a life without Luke. My affection for him had long faded, but the complexities of our shared life left me feeling trapped. Each day I worked tirelessly, returning home only to be tossed around by Luke's whims. This cycle persisted, draining me both physically and emotionally. Then one day, while I was trying to find solace in my room, Luke summoned me. It had been ages since we had a serious conversation, and his unusual excitement piqued my curiosity. "Addison, we need to talk," he said, his voice unusually eager. As I settled down for the discussion, Luke, with a fervor I hadn't seen before, dropped a bombshell. "I intend to let my parents live in our house," he said, his callous remark stinging me. "And by the way, your inability to cook is very inconvenient," he added, his words cutting deeper. What struck me even harder was his plan to force me out. "I want to change the house's ownership to include my parents, divorce you, and start a new family," he declared. "These decisions are final, and your objections won't change a thing," he concluded. I was unable to comprehend the decisions he'd voiced and felt a wave of dizziness come over me. "Why can't we live together with your parents?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They would love to be close to me again," he stated calmly, ignoring my emotions. "Addison, as the man of the house, it's my decision," Luke replied arrogantly, completely ignoring my words and feelings. I knew I couldn't continue a relationship with him any longer. It was just unbearable. Luke chuckled dismissively. "Your love for me blinds you." "I only want to take care of my family," he uttered playfully. I hadn't had any affection for him in a long, long time. "I've already fallen out of love with you," I said quietly. "All that remains is my astonishment at your selfishness and my regret for not ending things sooner," I added. Luke seemed to misunderstand, assuming my reluctance for divorce meant lingering love. "If you leave, you'll be on your own." "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice wavering. To clarify my feelings, I declared, "I'll leave." Luke, clearly unprepared for my agreement to a divorce, and my willingness to leave, was stunned. "You won't manage without me," he said, trying to regain control. "I've already fallen out of love with you," I repeated. Letting go of what's not needed feels liberating. My words hung in the air, leaving Luke looking utterly lost. I nodded, thanked him for everything, and walked away from our house. Back at my parents' place, I explained the situation to them. Their initial fury at Luke's behavior subsided when they realized I had a plan. With their support, I began the healing process. The first step was the divorce. After sending the papers, Luke messaged me, expressing uncertainty about the situation. I clarified my feelings, and he went silent. A few days later, I received the completed divorce papers from him. I promptly filled out my parts and submitted them to the county office. Now Luke and I were complete strangers. I no longer had the responsibility of supporting the household as his wife. During the divorce, we divided our assets. Luke claimed the house, a burden to me from the start, so I gladly gave it up. Instead, I opted for alimony. Since Luke wasn't working, his parents covered it, but he seemed to be actively job hunting, probably planning to repay them once he found stable employment. However, reality had a way of challenging even the best-laid plans. A month passed since the divorce was finalized, and I moved into a new home, enjoying a peaceful life. Then I received a call from Luke. Annoyance bubbled within me, but ignoring him might create more problems. So for the sake of my own future, I decided it was time to address the situation. "Hello, what do you want after all this time?" I answered the phone. My self-control was at an all-time low with him. His desperate plea for help barely registered as I urged him to get to the point. "Please help me," he implored. His tone, though desperate, only elicited a cynical laugh from me. I anticipated Luke being in a tough situation, but the severity of his predicament surprised me. "Well, what happened? You have to tell me or I won't know," I said, though I had a hunch about Luke's troubles. I wanted him to confess the details himself. Reluctantly, confused and stammering, he began to explain. "I became the full owner of our home. I managed fine for a month, but I recently struggled to pay the rent since I'm still unemployed. I thought my parents, who live on a pension, could cover the expense, but the bill was much higher than expected, around $1,800. They can't afford it, and they're furious. They approached me, and now I don't know what to do. I reached out to you because I'm lost and desperate." He concluded unhappily, despite the frustration bubbling within me. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction seeing him face the consequences of his actions. He blamed me, expressing his displeasure that I had not warned him about the ground lease. I acknowledged my mistake, but reminded him that his ignorance about the monthly cost was entirely his own doing. "You treated me like an outsider and pushed me away, and now you're reaping the consequences," I firmly stated. Surprised at his impertinent call, I listened as he continued his plea for help, persisting and seemingly oblivious to my feelings. "I need your help. We can't go on like this." Luke's voice carried a sense of urgency, highlighting their desperate situation. It was evident they felt cornered. I surmised that the rent due date had likely passed, and they might already be behind, given the landholder's notoriously hot temper. I remembered the stern warnings about never being late with rent payments while I lived there. Missing a payment could result in dire consequences. Luke, who was well acquainted with the landholder, understood this perfectly well. "I don't have anyone else to turn to. You still care about me, right?" Luke's words were laden with selfishness, expecting me to help just because we were once married. I wanted to tell him that my feelings for him had long faded, but I held my tongue. Instead, I coldly replied, "I'm sorry, but do I have any obligation to help you? You were the one who left me. Isn't it a bit too convenient that you came to me for help right now?" Luke attempted to defend himself, pleading for understanding. "Please don't be so cold. I really can't do this without you. Whether you still love me or not doesn't matter now. We used to be married. Can't you help me out just this once?" "No," I stated firmly, my patience wearing thin. "It's been a long time since I stopped loving you. You left me, and even before that, my feelings for you had already cooled." My response carried the weight of frustration and despair that had built up inside me over time. When I uttered those words, I could hear Luke's dejected voice on the other end of the phone. It hit me like a tidal wave of disbelief. For so long, I endured everything: his selfishness, his taking me for granted, his mistreatment, and even his indifference when I was sick, all in an attempt to salvage our marriage. I had invested my efforts into making our life together work, but this was the outcome. The question that haunted me was why I hadn't left sooner. Why hadn't I distanced myself from Luke when my love for him had faded? Regret flooded in, mingling with the anger I felt towards him. Throughout our time together, Luke never truly faced me. He never showed concern, never tried to protect me, and never considered walking through life hand in hand as a couple. Every time he treated me like a maid or a money-making machine, he remained oblivious to my despair. Yet despite all this being a result of Luke's actions, he had the audacity to plead for my help as if he were the victim. His attitude felt so self-centered that it was nauseating. "Please help me, I'm begging you. How about we get married again? This time we'll start over properly. I promise I'll never kick you out again," he said in desperation. I couldn't help but chuckle bitterly at his desperate proposal. "Remarry you? Are you kidding me? All of this is the result of your own actions. I've been trying for a long, long time to connect with you. I kept trying to make you face me. Now you're telling me to start all over again with you, pretending that none of that ever happened. Do you want me to go back to those hellish days? That would never happen. I'm not going back to that life, no matter what. I exclaimed, my emotions boiling over. Tears began to flow in a mix of anger and sadness. Luke remained silent in response to my words. Unable to bear any more of this conversation, I simply said goodbye and hung up. After that, Luke didn't call. Wanting never to hear his voice again, I blocked his number. Later, I heard from mutual friends that Luke and his family got evicted from their home. In his own way, Luke tried to talk to my former in-laws and get them to pay the rent on his behalf. However, they were furious, stating, "That's not what we talked about," and refused. Luke hadn't had much luck finding a full-time job, so he was working part-time to make ends meet. Apparently, because they had been living together, my former in-laws had to sell their house and were now cramped in a rundown apartment. All three of them. As for me, I became engrossed in my work. My boss even discussed a promotion with me. It seemed I might be the first female manager in our company, and I received admiration from both colleagues and juniors. Sometimes friends asked, "Are you going to get married again?" To be honest, after being forced into that kind of life, I had a negative view of marriage. The idea of dating a man or getting married again didn't appeal to me. But life was long, and there was no need to rush. At my age, many people live the rest of their lives unmarried. If I could live my life without regrets, that's all that mattered. If I could live true to myself, that was enough. With that in mind, I wanted to continue walking through life at my own pace.